Hello teacher, this is my video presentation about the final test that we carried out for the subject Ciencias del Lenguaje at the Profesorado en Inglés in third year at Josefina Conte Institute. And so the idea of this research is to provide information about people who acquire several languages at the same time by being immersed in diverse contexts. With this in mind, we will analyze and pinpoint whether age plays a relevant role in language acquisition. This arises the question, is the earlier the better? Answer which we will try to provide by developing specific implications towards bilingualism, how languages are learned, how bilingualism is defined, and the common assumptions that are drawn and linked to this notion. Apart from that, we will further explain the types of bilingualism that there exist and how the human brain affects the language system, meaning to see what happens in the speaker's brain. In order to point this out, a case that took place in Chile will try to demonstrate and explain what I have previously mentioned. After going through this path, features about bilingual speakers and how bilingualism affects the brain will prove and demonstrate not only how beneficial acquiring languages is, but that there is proof to state that there exists a time in life, a period of time in life, where language is better acquired. And therefore, we can say that the earlier is actually the better. And that is why the first point in this final task is to see how languages are learned. And in this case, Noam Chomsky claims that everything is in the brain and that children are biologically programmed for language acquisition, and that language develops in just the same way as the other biological functions. For Chomsky, language acquisition is similar to the development of walking. The environment is the basic contribution, and then the child's endowment will do the rest. For Chomsky, or according to Chomsky, children are not blank slates to be filled merely by imitating the language that they hear. Instead, he claims that children are actually born with a special ability to discover for themselves the underlying rules that there exist in a language system. Chomsky referred to this special ability as the LAD, which stands for Language Acquisition Device. This device was often described as an imaginary black box that is stored somewhere in the brain, which contains all the principles to all human languages. And that is why here Mark Patowski studied the relationship between age and the acquisition of a second language. And that is why he hypothesized that only those who began learning their second language before the age of 15 will be the only ones who will develop native-like mastery of the language. This age constraint is called the critical period hypothesis, and it states that there is a specific and limited time for language acquisition. And this arises the actual question, which is the earlier the better? Okay, in this case, when a parent or a legal guardian is asked to express why they are sending their kids to bilingual schools, most of the answers can be like these ones. Okay, everybody is sending their kids to bilingual schools. Okay, children need to know more languages than their own. Or maybe that why, if he is sending his or her kid to a bilingual school, why wouldn't mine go too? And this is absolutely true, since following the idea that there is a specific and limited time for language acquisition, a person does acquire a language in a better way when immersed in a context from a very young age. What researchers have found is that the brain processes and decodes information in another language from a very young period of time in life. So, following Chomsky's ideas that children are biologically programmed to develop languages, there are some children who develop two languages at the same time. This can be merely known as bilingualism, but the truth is that bilingualism can be defined as a person who produces and takes in meaningful and complete utterances in another language. In fact, if a person acquires two languages ever since he or she is born, the accurate term to refer to those individuals is sequential or simultaneous bilingual. In order to be a sequential or a simultaneous bilingual, there are some influencing factors that must take place. First of all, we have context. In order to be a sequential or a simultaneous bilingual, the context in which those children are immersed should be equally important. For example, both at home and at school. As a second influencing factor, we have time. And by time, we mean that the time that that child is exposed to the languages. And in this case, the time of exposure plays an important role only when and if that time of exposure is equally provided. And then the last but not the least influencing factor is the proficient input that that child receives or is exposed to. In this case, because the input that that child receives must be equally meaningful in both languages. And that is why, following this idea that people are capable of acquiring more than two languages at the same time, let's see what happens in our brain. Following Michel Paradi's ideas, the people that have always been in charge of figuring out these kind of questions are pathologists and neurolinguists, and they claim that there are at least four neurofunctionally modular cerebral mechanisms in charge of the language system, and they include the implicit linguistic competence, the metalinguistic knowledge, pragmatics, and motivation. As for the implicit linguistic competence that I have just mentioned, Michel claims that it is acquired incidentally because acquirers focus their attention on some linguistic elements over others. It is stored implicitly and used automatically by procedural memory. As for the metalinguistic knowledge, Michel claims that it is much more of a conscious process because it is acquired consciously, it is stored explicitly, and it is used by declarative memory. In this case, what Michel means, to put it differently, is that acquirers, in this case, are aware of what they are taking in. Coupled with metalinguistic knowledge and implicit linguistic competence, there are some other rules that play essential roles in our linguistic system. First of all, we have the social linguistic rules, which determine and decide the speaker's choice among various possible structures that are lying in his or her linguistic repertoire. And on the other hand, we have the paralinguistic rules that selects and makes use of gestures, patterns of intonation, and body language as support for the speaker's message he or she wants to convey. And then the last but clearly not the least, we have motivation. And motivation, according to Schumann's ideas, enables the amygdala and the dopaminergic system to work, meaning that once the dopamine is released, the desire for communication arises. So, in order to point this out, let's take an example of a case that took place in Chile, where a 9-year-old boy who is labeled as a simultaneous bilingual kid and a 13-year-old girl who is labeled as a sequential bilingual kid were asked to participate in such a study. So, in order to understand better this case of a study, there are two terms that should be explained in order to understand this whole case. The first one is code switching. As for code switching, we can say that it is the change that speakers make use of, the change of a language to another one. As for transfer, it is related to apply or the application of some linguistic features from one language to another one. So, as an overall summary of this whole case, what this research has shown is that both phenomena, that is to say code switching and transfer, occurred with higher frequency in the sequential bilingual girl. And as for the simultaneous bilingual kid who happens to be younger than she is, he has shown and demonstrated a greater influence in English as well as a more varied vocabulary. So let's take some time to devote it to see which are the advantages that being a bilingual provides. In this case, first of all, we have the socioeconomic advantages, which includes more opportunities to get jobs worldwide, for example, and then the metalinguistic advantages as better learners when separating meaning from form. Then we have the cultural advantages, that is to say, we have access to several cultures with great acceptance, and then the cognitive or linguistic advantages, including the development of a heightened sensitivity to conversational patterns, adjustments of the level of activation to each language, and a better development regarding the executive functions. So we have reached the final part of this final task for Ciencias del Lenguaje, and all things considered, we can say that the question whether about knowing whether it is better to acquire a language at an early stage in life has been fully answered. It has been fully answered by developing implications, as I said at the beginning of this video, towards what bilingualism means, what it involves, and the types that there exist in our world, in the language system. Also, have we seen the how the brain works, and we have examined an actual case that took place in Chile, demonstrating that the younger is the better. That is to say, that the earlier is indeed the better.